Welcome again, everyone. Thank you for joining the Caregiving and Elder Mistreatment webinar today. As NCBA hosts this webinar with the National Center on Elder Abuse and also Miss Pat Hawkins. The first of our two presenters is Lori Mars, JD, LLM. She is the director of the National Center on Elder Abuse and the Elder Abuse Guide for Law Enforcement. She is an assistant professor of clinical family medicine in the Department of Family Medicine at the Keck School of Medicine of USC, University of Southern California. After practicing law for over 20 years, Ms. Mars' concentration lies at the intersection of law, aging, education, and elder abuse. She has a master's in law in alternative dispute resolution and serves as a volunteer long-term care ombudsman. Lori received her Juris Doctorate degree from Loyola Law School and her Master's of Law degree from the University of Southern California. Welcome, Lori. Thank you for joining us. Our second presenter, Patricia A. Hawkins, MPH, is a public health professional and community advocate with more than 50 years of experience supporting older adults and strengthening community health systems. She spent over 3 decades with the Oklahoma State Department of Health, serving as both a microbiologist and a public health consultant focused on elder care and local health services. Ms. Hawkins also taught case management and gerontology at Langley University's School of Nursing and Health Professions, mentoring future health professionals. A master trainer in chronic diseases and diabetes self-management, she continues to advocate for policies and programs that improve the well-being and dignity of older adults and families. Welcome, Ms. Hawkins. The floor is now yours. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angela and Angie, for giving us the opportunity to present today. And I also wanted to acknowledge and thank my colleague and co-presenter, Ms. Pat Hawkins. As you've heard, she's extremely accomplished, but in addition to all the things you heard, she's also one of 6 outstanding lay advisory board members for the National Center on Elder Abuse. She's an elder justice champion in the community and nationally, and it's an honor to present alongside her. So today, Ms. Pat is going to address the first part of our discussion on caregiving, but we're going to introduce the topic of caregiving by referring to a column written by professor and philosopher Kwame Anthony Appiah with the New York Times. He responds to ethical dilemmas that are sent in by readers. And a few years ago, he wrote this response to a reader's question about caregiving for her husband. And we thought this would be a nice way to frame the conversation on caregiving. So this is the letter or a portion of the letter that was written to the professor. I strongly suspect that my husband is developing dementia. His doctors have found nothing wrong with him. I understand that cognition tests might not find anything wrong in the early stages of disease. In the meantime, our decades-long relationship has eroded, and my insistence that he engage with me in a quality relationship has led to endless fighting and brought me to the brink of divorce. I understand that dementia is at the root of our problems, and I've quit trying to fix our relationship. Our fighting has stopped, but it's a lonely place to be, and I'm not thrilled about spending my retirement years as a caregiver. It's a huge sacrifice that will narrow my own life significantly. Do we both need to go down with the ship? Can I leave him now, or am I obligated to stay and care for him? You may have a whole lot of reactions to what this letter, this author wrote. And the ethicist provided I think, a very measured and beautiful response that I'm going to share with you shortly. But we share this excerpt here to acknowledge that caregiving can be very difficult, and even the prospect of caregiving can be frightening, as you can see from this letter to the ethicist. The benefits of providing care to a loved one can be profound, but there are challenges as well. So I'm now going to turn to Miss Pat to begin the conversation on caregiving.
Good afternoon. Let me first bring you greetings from the state of Oklahoma. And I'm very happy to be a part of this today. In starting to look at caregiving, former First Lady Rosalind Carter describes really a very profound definition or profound knowledge of what caregiving is all about. And as a person who have been around some time, a decade, and dealing with older adults, families, and so forth, I meet this criteria, and that there being four kinds of people in the world: those who have been caregivers, which I have, those who are currently caregivers, and I'm in that role, even as a long distance caregiver to my sister who lives in another state. And those who will be caregivers, I expect to reach out to neighbors, community members, and even members of my family who may need caregivers, and so forth, for those who will need caregivers. And I don't rule out that I will need caregiving. Next slide. And so when we begin to look at caregiving, if you are a family caregiver, you are actually part of something truly important. Especially in this country, around 63 million people are caregivers. Some are paid and some are not, who are unpaid. And we'll be speaking mostly to people who are unpaid caregivers today, family caregivers. But together you make up about 1 in every 4 adults. That means chances are most families will need help from someone like you at some point in their lives, especially as our older population grows. The need for caregiving will also grow. And so the work you do is worth so much, with your efforts adding up to over $1 trillion each year. You're especially needed by folks dealing with Alzheimer's disease or other memory problems. So caregivers like you, or those you may work with, put in millions of hours helping them live better. But it's not just about the numbers. What you do brings families closer, helps people stay strong, it builds a sense of respect and support in our communities. You make a big difference, not only for those you care for, but for all of us. Next slide. Now, who are caregivers? Caregivers, let me first of all tell you that you are the heart of our long-term care system, and you play a huge role in the public health system. And this includes both informal caregivers like family members and friends, paid family members who care for others. Most caregivers are women with an average age of 51, but people from all walks of life are actually stepping up as caregivers. We're seeing in more narratives from men, and actually many children are caregivers. In some families, grand families where children are living with grandparents, it's not uncommon for children to get up and make certain that grandma or grandpa is going to be all right that day, and carry the stress of caregivers by worrying about them and so forth. So, as I say, lots of folks are really stepping up to become caregivers. On the average, caregivers spend about 25 hours each week supporting others. 1 out of 4 put in over 40 hours a week. Nearly a quarter care for more than one person, and about 30% are also raising children under 18. They're within that sandwich generation. And so among caregivers, 7 out of 10 hold a job, and 18 million of those people are wage workers. Whether they are caring for loved ones or working in the field, caregivers are truly the background, are truly the backbone of our nation's support system, making a real difference every day. And as I say, that's worth repeating, that caregivers are truly the backbone of our nation's support system. Next slide. What do caregivers do? If you asked a caregiver, they would probably tell you whatever needs to be done is what caregivers do. But caregivers perform a multitude of tasks. They play a very crucial role in supporting the people that they care for, the care recipients, by addressing both their social and health needs. They offer companionship, foster well-being, and so forth for those who care for, and also within the family. They provide emotional encouragement to help recipients stay in positive spirits and assist with daily tasks. Those activities of daily living are instrumental activities of daily living, such as bathing, dressing, meal preparation, medication management. Caregivers are also managers, and that they help the care recipients manage their health conditions. They are the communicators in terms of dealing with the health professionals, service providers, and use problem-solving skills to identify valuable resources, to create creative ways to deal with situations and so forth. So by collaborating with family members, another very important role of a caregiver is collaboration and keeping families together. Caregivers work to maximize everyone's strength, ensuring the highest level of care and support for those that they assist. And so the bottom line is that family caregivers really, family caregivers role, it really does not come with a job description. It may differ from person to person, and there's a story behind every caregiver. Next slide. You can see here, this slide, gives very well of who caregivers are providing care for. The care recipients, in most are parents, older parents, 41%. Some 29% are special needs children, 20% someone else, and then 18% being spouse or partners. And I do want to also point out, when we look in terms of that 29% being special needs children, we're actually not talking about kinship families in terms of where we're dealing with grandparents raising grandchildren. Next slide. The benefits of caregiving. Caregiving brings benefits to all persons who are there. Brings benefits to the caregiver, benefits to the care recipient, and I've already mentioned the benefits that it brings to the community, our public health system, our long-term care system. But when we look at the personal benefits for the caregiver, I think the best way to say it is that caregiving is compassion in action. And it fosters deep emotional bonds. It increases a person's purpose for what we do and for being here. It's part of personal growth. And it also promotes important family values. It gives one the opportunity to model what they want to see passed down from generation to generation. That compassion in action. For the recipient, increase comfort and safety. Being cared for by a person, by a loved one, a family member, in a familiar environment reduces anxiety and stress. And where possible, it promotes healing. In fact, most folks really want to be at home, whatever their care condition might be. And so for caregiving allows them to be home, to maintain independence and dignity, and allows the person more control over their environment. Enhanced social interaction for the individual who is receiving care. Regular, loving, and familiar interactions help that individual from feeling isolated. And so it fosters better health outcomes. Next slide. However, caregiving brings with it challenges. And we won't go through all of these numbers and so forth, but it is important to know that today 1 in 5 adults are both working and providing care for a loved one. And there's a significant rise from just a few years ago when 1 in 7 persons were doing this. So balancing these dual roles is very challenging. Next slide. with the impact of caregiving and the various, basically those challenges that do create many of the impacts and so forth. Because one of the things to keep in mind is that many caregivers receive little or no training or support, and they have little time to plan for these increasing demands, and it often leaves them feeling both unprepared as well as overwhelmed. And so when we begin to look at the basic impacts, many of them are financial, is that lots of folks go into debt when they become caregivers and so forth. So on the average, caregivers spend about 20% of their income on essential needs, and that increases stress levels. If we look socially at the impacts, is that many caregivers lack family or friends. One quarter of caregivers do not have adequate finances, have experienced financial setbacks, and 1 in 5 struggle to meet the necessities like food. Health impacts are significant and so forth. Many caregivers themselves have multiple chronic conditions. Nearly 54% of older caregivers have at least two chronic conditions and so forth. And so the impacts there are financial, social, as well as health. Next. Now, how can the community members better support caregivers? Because, as I say, this is a problem that belongs to all of society. And all of us have a role in making certain that caregiving really works. And so the community, first of all, when we think in terms of community members, I think it's important to know that communities differ. And so your neighborhood may not be your community. Your community may be your social network. It may be your church. And so when we look in terms of what communities can do, a number of them, they can help with just basic practical needs. They can help connect with resources, help find care, encourage caregivers, to seek support, community assistance, mental health services, make sure they're managing their own. But one of the important things around it in dealing with your community, wherever that community is, it's important to let your community know what you need. Next. How can the church better respond to the needs of caregivers? And this is one of the areas that I've been working in and trying to bring my expertise to is how can I increase the role of the church and how can I equip my church to better respond to the needs of caregivers? One of the things that's so important is that churches know their members, especially their older adults. And they know when changes occur. They know when there are even changes that may not be individual, but even family changes. So caring for loved ones can be very overwhelming, but the church community can make a really big difference. But it can help by building stronger connections. It can help caregivers feel less alone and more supported. We can work together, and what I'm hoping that we can do within our church, it can work together to fill gaps and care by sharing ideas, partnering with local organizations, offering practical help for those in need. It's important to understand how the caregiving system is changing and recognizing the challenges that are being faced by working families. And this is definitely one of the roles that the church can do. The church can be a voice for caregivers. It's a voice for the families. And so it can share with what is going on in churches. It can also be the persons like myself who volunteer and sit on committees, who attend meetings, and who will carry the message and speak openly when caregivers are when they're just out of their voice. Okay, next slide. And in looking at the societal support that's available for caregivers, caregivers will benefit and definitely support when they have the comprehensive services they need. And so this is one of the roles that can come from society, is that we can put programs in place that will allow easy access to resources, robust support networks that lighten their daily responsibilities. One of the things that we're looking at in Oklahoma is creating what's called know a wrong door. And so that all agencies are on the same page with caregivers and with family members and older adults. That, in other words, if you go into a county health department, is that rather than giving the person the runaround, is that they will know how to refer them to the appropriate resources. It's going to take quite a bit of training and so forth to make certain that agencies are aware of caregiving needs. But as I say, it's a societal issue, it's a social issue, it's a public health issue. And so it becomes an issue that's important to all of us. And so, as I say, caregivers deserve financial security. They deserve workplace protections, paid leave tailored to their needs, opportunities for future planning, and so forth. So, and this is one of the things that we can look to for society. Next slide, please. Now, some best practice tips and takeaways from this is that it's very important for caregivers, first of all, to know your rights as a caregiver. And caregivers do have rights. AARP basically prepared a caregiver's uh, rights, caregiver rights document, which is very helpful. And really, caregivers should be aware of it. And also, caregivers is very important. One of the most important things is that caregivers need to take care of themselves. So caring for oneself is one of the most essential and also one of the most forgotten things to do as a caregiver. And so when you take care of your needs as a caregiver, you're in a better position to meet the needs of the person that you're caring for. And I think the guiding principle should be is that when you're traveling and you step aboard that plane, that the hostess says to you that in case you need to use if that oxygen mask drops, and in case you need to use it, if you're traveling with someone, is that the person who should be fitted first with the mask is yourself, because you cannot take care of someone else if you don't take care of yourself. And so caregivers also can advocate and join or form a caregiver support group to strengthen collective voices. If there's not one in your church, ask for one and so forth. Engage with local organizations and help providers to request more accessible resources and training opportunities. Many times, service providers, if they don't know your needs, they don't know they're not meeting your needs. Share personal stories with policymakers, employers, community leaders to highlight the real needs and successes. Promote and utilize technology that connects caregivers and facilitates peer groups, peer support and information sharing. And also, one of the things that are really important that we may not take the time to do as a caregiver, because caregiving is stressful and so forth, but it's really important to participate in surveys and feedback sessions to ensure that programs evolve to meet the changing needs. And so, for instance, if what has been said here today, if the survey asks for your input, it's very important that you do that. It's the only way we know to make the kind of changes or to voice the kind of concerns that need to be voiced. And so I believe that's the end of what I have to say, and I hope I've not taken up too much of your time, Lori.
No, that was perfect. Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. So let's take all of those things that we learned from Miss Pat, and now we're going to return to the ethicist and his response to the letter writer. Remember, she wrote to him. She was concerned about being a caregiver for her husband. Oh, sorry, turned off my video there. She was concerned about providing care to a husband who she believed had dementia, even though there was no proof of it. This is the ethicist response in part. In a loving relationship, you support your spouse through hard times, including illness and decline, because you can't easily imagine doing otherwise. The shared experiences and memories of a life together enable you to find warmth amid the cold spells. You talk about how your husband has changed. It's also possible that you've changed. If medical professionals haven't diagnosed dementia, consider that your personal assessment could be mistaken. Either way, it sounds as if your worry isn't so much that you'll become a caregiver as that you won't have a loving relationship with the person you'd be caring for. Before you sever ties, though, I would encourage you to explore couples counseling attuned to the challenges of dementia. See if you can cultivate your own well being while finding activities that play to your husband's strengths. You should be able to grieve what is being lost and acknowledge whatever moments of resentment you feel without shame. I'm not saying that you're required to sacrifice your well being to his. The special obligations we have to our loved ones are rooted in the value we place on our relationships with them, with all the resilience and fragility of those relationships. Still, I hope you'll figure out a way to balance your needs with your husband's. That doesn't mean going down with the ship. It means trying to find a way to keep the ship afloat. Very profound words, I think, from the ethicist. And we don't know what the letter writer did in this case, but we do know that caregiving is nuanced, complex, and every situation is different. But resources and supports are available, and we'll share some at the end of the presentation. But I'm now going to turn to the next part of the presentation, to elder abuse. And as we shift focus, I do want to be clear that most caregivers do their very best for loved ones and have the best intentions. And a very small percentage of caregivers have malintent and want to cause harm or steal or otherwise abuse a loved one. But some caregivers may lack the knowledge or the skills or the ability to care for a loved one, and many don't have training as caregiving duties may be thrust upon them. And others may not have the desire or willingness or resources to care for someone. There also may be complicated family dynamics between the caregiver and care recipient that impacts the relationship. Now, most of the time, these issues don't lead to abuse, but sometimes they do. Saying something mean, being too rough, taking money, and most abuse is committed by family members or those closest to us, and that's just the fact. It's uncomfortable to discuss, but it's important to understand so that we can prevent it and intervene if it does occur. It's estimated that 1 in 10 community dwelling older adults experiences some form of abuse each year. And of the 7 million people with dementia in this country, 1 in 3, or by some estimates, 1 in 2 older adults will experience abuse. And yet, only 1 in 24 cases of abuse is reported. And that's a really troubling statistic because it means that most older people are not getting the help and resources they need to prevent abuse or mitigate harms. And the largest reason for that is abuse is often committed by family members. And older adults are very reluctant to report family. They may feel shame and embarrassment that someone so close to them has inflicted this harm, and they may not want to publicly reveal these private, intimate acts of abuse. Some may fear retaliation or worse treatment. And we know some older adults are dependent upon family for food, clothing, and shelter and other necessities. And they may fear that if they do report, they'll be evicted, left homeless, or placed in a nursing home. We also know that social isolation and loneliness is a huge concern for people across the life course, but especially so for older adults whose reserves and resources may have eroded over time. And an older adult may prefer to be with an abusing family member than be with no one at all. Some older adults, think of someone maybe with advanced Alzheimer's disease, they may lack the ability to recognize when abuse has occurred, when someone has stolen from them or someone has yelled at them. And they may lack the faculties to report that abuse to appropriate authorities. There's also a good number of people who don't want to report a loved one. Subject them to criminal or civil liability and under reports of abuse. Now, let's turn to the definition of abuse. This is just a general definition from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention that abuse is an intentional act or failure to act that causes or creates a risk of harm to an older adult, with an older adult defined as someone aged 60 or older, and the abuse occurring at the hands of a caregiver or a person the older adult trusts. Now, every state has one or more definitions of abuse, and the definitions do vary a bit, but they're largely consistent. But it's also important to understand that our contextual and interpersonal perceptions of what constitutes abuse may differ. So, what one person may consider to be abuse may not reach the standard of abuse for another person, notwithstanding statutory definitions. Lots of things go into this mix, like faith, family, context, community, experience, history. They're all relevant and they impact our respective conceptualizations of abuse. So when we work with or we are in contact with or deal with older people who have experienced abuse, it's very important to be person-centered in our response and understand what's most important to the older person. In terms of types of mistreatment, and mistreatment can happen anywhere to anyone. There are generally 5 types. You see 6 here on the screen, and I'll explain that. But by definition, physical abuse is the use of physical force or coercion that may result in injury. And it can manifest as hitting, beating, biting, slapping. These are just some examples, not an exhaustive list. But physical abuse also includes any unlawful, unnecessary, or excessive use of force or convert or to confine or coercion to confine or restrain an older adult, like force feeding or physical restraints or chemical restraints, like over medicating someone, which sometimes occurs in facilities. Psychological abuse is the infliction of anguish, pain, or distress, and it can manifest as intimidation, harassment, threats, insults, or isolation. Sexual abuse is non-consensual sexual contact of any kind, and that includes assault, battery, intimidation, or harassment. And any form of sexual contact with someone who lacks the capacity to give consent, like someone in a nursing home with advanced Alzheimer's lacks the capacity to consent. Financial abuse is the misappropriation of someone's money, property, or assets for another person's gain. And neglect is the refusal or failure to provide for all or anyone's or part of anyone's duties towards an older adult. For example, if an adult child has taken it upon himself to provide care for his older parent and he doesn't do so, like he doesn't provide him with medication or food, um, or any other of the necessities that he agreed to provide care for, that would be considered neglect. Self-neglect is sometimes considered a form of mistreatment, but it's also sometimes considered a related phenomenon because self-neglect, by definition, is the refusal or inability to provide for all or anyone's duties towards themselves, towards financial matters or healthcare matters. And it's related to abuse because when we self-neglect, we become more vulnerable, and that vulnerability can expose us to harm from others. But self-neglect often is a precursor to the other types of abuse. It often co-occurs with the other types of abuse. And it's also the most commonly reported condition to Adult Protective Services, which is the social services agency that investigates allegations of abuse and neglect. In terms of the impacts of abuse, as you can imagine, they are quite significant, resulting in medical and mental health consequences, increased cognitive decline, social isolation and disconnection, poverty and homelessness. There's a 3 times higher mortality rate for older adults who are abused than those who are not, and billions of dollars a year are lost as a result of elder abuse. So in the next couple slides, I'm going to share information about the signs of abuse, and then after that, the risk factors of abuse. And to me, they're like bookends to give you a sense of what's going on in the older adults world. Regarding the signs of abuse, especially as to the physical signs and emotional signs, they may be causally related to another source. For example, a medical condition that someone has, or cognitive impairment, or mental health condition. Or some of these things could be a consequence of medication that people are taking, or even perhaps the natural part of the aging process. But barring those things, it's important to consider whether abuse is occurring. And these are some signs of abuse, not a comprehensive list, but some signs. So for the physical signs, dehydration or unusual weight loss, missing daily living aids like glasses, a walker, or medication, unexplained injuries, including bruises, cuts, or sores, torn or stained underclothing, unattended medical needs, and unexplained sexually transmitted diseases. As we move to emotional or behavioral signs of abuse, I would repeat the same things I said before. They could be related to another causal factor. But it's also important to understand that we all are different and unique, and we all experience stress or strain or abuse in different ways. So it's important to understand the individual. And if you see them over a course of time, are there changes? Changes from prior patterns of conduct or prior behavior. And if there is a change, for example, if that change is increased fear or anxiety, or if it's isolation from friends or family, unusual changes in behavior or sleep, or withdrawal from normal activities, are those changes due to one of the other causal factors I mentioned before, or are they due to abuse? Again, these are just some signs. And similarly for financial signs, these are just some signs. There are many signs of financial abuse, but it can include fraudulent signatures on financial documents, unusual or sudden changes in spending patterns, or unpaid bills. For risk factors of abuse, it's important to understand the risk factors, because once we understand the risks that are present in someone's life, then perhaps we can identify interventions to reduce the risk. So we use a model called the Abuse Intervention Prevention Model, and you can see that model on the screen. There are three main domains: the vulnerable older adult, the trusted other, and the context of their relationship. And there are risk factors within each of those domains that independently or in combination with other risk factors could indicate an increased likelihood of exposure to abuse. So for example, I've listed some risk factors here on this screen, but again, not a comprehensive list, just some examples, but common examples for the older adult: chronic medical conditions, mental health impairments, cognitive deficits, prior trauma exposure, or functional deficits. These are all things that can create vulnerability, and those vulnerabilities can reduce our resources and our resilience, and they can create susceptibility, exposing us to risk of harm from others. For the trusted other, very commonly we see someone who's economically dependent on the older adult or emotionally dependent on the older adult. Sometimes they have substance abuse issues. And in cases of financial exploitation, it's common to see a feeling that they're of entitlement, like that trusted other is entitled to the older adult's assets. And then we look at the context of the relationship between the older adult and the trusted other. What is the level of social connectedness for each of these individuals and their neighbors, with family members, with their community, with faith networks? Because social support is a buffer that can reduce the risk of abuse, and it's really important. It's also important in the aftermath of abuse for people to have supports that they need to help them through the difficulties in following abuse. Cultural norms: what are the cultural norms for each of these individuals, and how does it impact their definitions, perceptions of, and responses to abuse? And then what's the context of the relationship between this older adult and the trusted other, and what does that look like? Is it, for example, an adult child and an older parent? And maybe over the course of time, they've had a wonderful relationship, and maybe they've had a difficult relationship. And perhaps that could impact a caregiving relationship that may occur later in life. Excuse me. So I mentioned when we identify risks, we can identify, hopefully in most cases, interventions. For example, if an older adult is socially isolated, There are things we can do to connect them with resources, with area agencies on aging, with support groups, with transportation, with things that can increase their social support and increase that buffer. If there's a trusted other who has substance abuse issues, if they get treatment, that will reduce the risk of abuse. And in a case, for example, of an older adult with advanced Alzheimer's disease and a younger adult, perhaps who's caring for that individual, even though dementia is a progressive and degenerative disease, there are still opportunities for intervention, therapy, maybe medication. There are opportunities for caregiver supports, the Alzheimer's Association, AARP, caregiver resource centers, support groups and peer groups and helplines and hotlines, perhaps caregiver respite. So there are opportunities for intervention to reduce risk when we do see it. In terms of intervention and prevention, I mentioned Adult Protective Services. They're the social services agency that investigates allegations of abuse and neglect in the community. Long-term care ombudsmen in facilities represent residents' rights and they advocate on behalf of residents in facilities. There are licensing departments in each state. Reports can be made to them about abuse in facilities as well. And law enforcement can be a reporting resource. Legal aid can provide a lot of support in terms of prevention and response. For prevention, they can help prepare advanced directives so people can identify their healthcare wishes and preferences. If at some later time they're unable to identify those, so to make sure they are documented. Powers of attorney to designate someone to act in your behalf if at some later time you're unable to act on your own behalf, if you have some kind of incapacity. And legal aid can also help in the aftermath of abuse by helping with access to elder abuse restraining orders or other orders of protection. And they can also help with recovery of assets potentially that have been stolen. Education and awareness is always important to understand those signs and risk factors of abuse. Financial literacy is very important and is available through a number of resources on our website, on the Consumer Financial Protection Board resources, and Federal Trade Commission. The most important thing are social supports, community-based interventions, and faith networks, all very, very important resources to prevent abuse and to provide support if abuse has in fact occurred. So I wanted to share also some information and some resources. First, I want to let you know that World Elder Abuse Awareness Day is every June 15th, and we create awareness, recognition of the importance of older adults everywhere across the country and across the world, and to acknowledge the importance of elder justice and to reject abuse, neglect, and exploitation wherever it occurs. And I should say there are lots of ways to engage in World Elder Abuse Awareness Day activities. On our website, we have a page dedicated to different opportunities to engage, and that can include community events. It can include we have a walk for WEAD or action for WEAD. We have lots of materials that are available that can be personalized by you, by your organizations, in your communities. And we're here to help and support you. We document all of the activities that are occurring across the country. And we're, again, anything that we can do at the National Center to support you, we are available. But in conjunction with the World Elder Abuse Awareness Day, we also host with Safe Havens Interfaith Partnership Against Domestic Violence and Elder Abuse, a national weekend of prayer and action for elder justice. That's going to take place June 12th through 14th. Lots of materials available on our website as well. And we also have on the right, you can see this new faith community action guide that we developed with ways for faith communities to become involved through sermons or prayers or other forms of engagement through posts and newsletters, acknowledging and highlighting the lives and experiences of older congregants and partaking in this initiative. We also have a number of publications on our website that are available. You can see on the left the caregiving Q&A we developed with NCBA on supporting wellness for yourself and loved ones. We also have tips and tools for safe and supportive caregiving and some more caregiving resources. And then we also have a number of faith resources as well, and I encourage you to go to our website for that information. We have resources listed here, and they're available, and I think they may be in the chat as well for you to access. And then we want to thank you so much, of course, for listening to this presentation and for being with us today. There is a QR code on the screen. It's very important. It has us to do continuous quality improvement. So if you'd like to take a picture of that and fill out the survey, we would be very happy to hear from you. And now I'm going to go to Q&A and turn to Angie.
Thank you, Lori. Thank you very much to both of you and Ms. Hawkins. We have a little bit of reverb there. Just a second. Okay. Thank you very much. As a current caregiver, I want to say thank you. Your presentation was thoughtful and it means the world to me. So thank you. I'd like to ask, I have three questions here that I'd like to start off with. One, I'd like to ask either of you if you could define what is respite care and how do I go about getting it? And I'd like to preface that by saying that in my community where I live, I'm in search of respite care. I know what it is, but I'm in search of care just for the weekend. And I've not been able to find any resources or services that can help me just have a weekend to myself. So I'd like to, one, ask you, either of you to please, if you can, define respite care and maybe give some ideas of how one might be able to find weekend assistance.
If, I'll respond, is that there are resources for respite. And first of all, respite is caregiver relief. Is that it is an opportunity for the caregiver to just do some things that they want to do, away from the care recipient. And usually respite is available when the caregiver is out of the home. And so we have the respite, actually we have the Old Americans Act provides monies for respite care that usually would come down through the state offices on aging or your area agency on aging. There should also be caregiver connections resources within your area to tap into that caregiver network. And that caregiver network will be able to identify for you what sources of respite are there. And respite can range all the way from someone coming into the home while you are away, and that in some it would depend upon where you live and what states it may differ. And sometimes respite can also be that the loved one can spend the weekend in a nursing facility, in a rehab facility, and so forth. But just as a way to give that caregiver some relief. And I will be frank with you, it isn't always easy to find respite. And so, but as a caregiver, one of the things that's first out there is to connect into that caregiver connection. And that caregiver connection will let you know what is available, within your state, within your area.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ms. Hawkins. Ms. Hawkins, you also spoke to the role of employers in the journey of a caregiver. When one becomes a caregiver, what should they do? How should they bring their employer into the fold? And then what response should the caregiver anticipate or expect from their employer?
Well, I'll put it this way. I don't know if you have any children, but going back into my work experience, is at the moment I became, that I realized that I was expecting a child, I let the folks, my employer know, my supervisor knew, and the other employees, my peers, knew that I was expecting a child. And so when coming into a position as a caregiver, I think you should give them advance notice that as that, for instance, my mother had a stroke back in the 2000, even though she was in another state, but the folks that I work with knew that my mother had had a stroke because I let them know. I let folks within my network also know because I work a lot in the aging network. I let them know too because from them, resources could come. They could give me information, provide support for me, but just advising, the employer up front, that I'm now in a caregiving role. And that indicates right there that, I'm going to need some help. I'm going to need some supports and so forth. And sometimes, as I say, employers don't know how to support someone. And so that may be something you have to say to them. These are the kinds of things that I need. Find out also, for instance, your Family Medical Leave Act,
Mhm.
if that's there, what kind of benefits are available through that. Also check with your insurance company, to see what kind of that's available also through insurance coverage and so forth. Hmm?
Okay, thank you, and thank you very much. Lori, I'd like to ask you, you spoke to abuse. Who can report abuse? Can any person report abuse, or is it a healthcare provider? How is elder abuse reported?
Thank you for that question. Well, anyone can report abuse if you see or suspect abuse, and anyone can do it. There are also certain professionals that are legally required to report. They're called mandated reporters.
Mhm.
And the definition of a mandated reporter differs from state to state. So in some states, everyone's a mandated reporter. In other states, it may be, as you mentioned, healthcare professionals, or it could be financial professionals. It really depends upon the state statute. But in terms of if anyone who sees or suspects abuse, they can report.
Okay, thank you very much. And Ms. Hawkins, you mentioned that people are living longer, and we know that. What are both of your recommendations for us speaking with our loved ones and our family to better prepare for caregiving? I know for myself, caregiving came on suddenly overnight, and when I think about my caregiving journey, I wished my parent and I had talked about what we anticipate caregiving might look like. And so what are your recommendations for those of us who may not be caregiving now, but caregiving might become a reality? How do we prepare for caregiving?
Planning, planning, planning,
Okay.
and so forth, and just basically just and being more aware. And as we grow older, just knowing things that we can anticipate will happen. I go back to being a parent. You know, when at the birth of my child, I didn't know that much about, the school systems. So I knew by the time that my daughter became kindergarten age, I needed to know a lot more about the school systems. So I began to investigate, ask questions, pay attention. Well, we've got to give that same type of attention to long-term care and to know that long-term care is in the term itself, long-term, is that it requires planning. It requires getting to know just basically what is out there as resources, knowing what is respite, how do you get respite? What are the types of decisions that need to be made? And really, in many communities, the planning is going to be really necessary because it means preparing. When we plan, also preparing. Is that if you don't have the resources, what are you going to do in terms of housing? Oh, okay, if mom or dad has to come out of their house, is it going to be a situation where they would come to stay with you or you stay with them? And years ago, the expectation in my community is that, because of the community, is that that value system being passed along as a model, that compassion in action is that It would just go from generation to generation.
Right.
Well, now we know that generations are not always in the same house, in the same community, within the same city or state. So we've got to prepare and so forth, because when my mother had a stroke, I was in Oklahoma. She was still in Arkansas. So how did I manage that? How do we manage those things? How do we identify the resources that can help us get to those, to do the things that need to be done?
Thank you, Ms. Hawkins. And to just to build upon that, do we bring in all of the family, some of the family? Do we have a designated person? And is this conversation certainly not a one-off? So is it one that we have around holiday, family gatherings?
Yes.
Okay, okay.
When that family, and absolutely, it should be all family members. This is one of the times that you really want to pull up on the strengths of everyone within the family. Everyone has something that can be offered. And so by waiting until, because I think most people kind of be out there hoping that it doesn't happen.
Yes.
But when it does happen, especially in terms of chronic illnesses and so forth, families go through what's kind of known as fractured family syndrome. And when something happens, the family just breaks. Nobody is who's in charge, who does this. Nobody is, and so relying upon backgrounds, trainings, and within a family, just like going to the churches, there are so many levels of expertise that's there that we oftentimes don't even realize are there until oftentimes it's too late. But it means working together. It means having these conversations that, mom and now is getting to be older. She's in her 80s. What's happening to most people who are 80 years old and so forth. But yes, planning, conversations, and actually making those conversations, and when they become more common, it becomes easier to talk about them. It becomes easier to get ready, for them. And so lots of times we shy away from them because we feel that planning for long-term care means that we're coming toward the end of life. And those are the types of decisions that absolutely, that occur in the roles of caregivers.
Thank you, Ms. Hawkins. And we have time for one more question. And I'm going to ask either of you to respond, please, if you like. What advice would you give to those individuals who might be solo aging and need care and may not have a family structure, but will need to look toward community? Where do they start?
Sometimes let's hope they'll get an early start.
Okay.
And,
Okay.
and let's hope and that is one of the reasons, being connected to a church, being connected to a community, and even persons who have families. I grew up in a household, and I didn't realize what my mom was doing, but I grew up in a household where we would look up and there would always be somebody new. When one of my siblings would grow up and graduate from high school and move, I'd look, mother would have somebody else there. And I finally saw what she was creating and maintaining a social network that when someone stepped out of it, she brought somebody else in. And so those are the kinds of things that we have, that's part of planning. Those are the kinds of things we can't wait until they happen, because you can't, because actually, well, caregiving is so personal, it's so hands-on that you can't just bring anyone in and so forth. And so we've just got to realize the value of it, the need for it, the necessity. This is why in many communities, starting with the churches, and because it is a venue for training, the opportunities are there. And going back to even the mandated reporter responsibility, that is one of the things now that will face churches. I read recently where about 14 states now have mandate laws that require that clergy ministers being mandated reporters. Oklahoma is not one of those, but I'm sure it's one of those things that will come across the network as to how do we bring caregiving in? How do we talk about abuse without frightening people to know that if you see this, you are mandated to make those, to do those reports and so forth. But planning, early on planning and bringing in the resources, setting up support groups, and many support groups for caregivers can come out of just basically conditions, such as starting with what appears to be a problem in some churches, a diabetes support group, a breast cancer support group. And then you can begin to let those things grow and grow to meet the needs of the church.
Ms. Hawkins, perfect segue to thank you and Lori for today's webinar. Perfect. Thank you both very much. This has been very thoughtful. I certainly learned a lot today. And I hope this isn't a one-off, because we do need to continue this conversation about caregivers, caregiver supports, and so forth. Thank you again. And to our audience, thank you for taking the time for your comments. We appreciate them. Angela has asked me to remind you to please complete the survey. And our webinar next week, Thursday, March 19th at 1 p.m. is entitled Manage Your Overall Health Through Preventing Falls. We look forward to you joining us. And again, to Lori and Ms. Hawkins, thank you again.
And Angie, I'm so happy to hear you use the term conversations, because when we say conversations, that means this is something we're going to talk about.
We are going to talk about it, and I
Something that
certainly hope you will be here to converse with me and our audience. I learned so much, and I'm very thankful.
Yes. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you so much. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you both.
Thank you both. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.